Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Sasha Mackler. Really excited to be here today. We have a great conversation in store for you. Our topic today is implementation and scale and what's next for energy innovation. And more directly, what's the formula for deploying the important new resources made available to the Department of Energy to demonstrate and commercialize a range of new advanced energy technologies? And importantly, how is the government working with the private sector to ensure that these new programs are successful? The federal government, as we all know, if we've been paying attention to the climate and energy space, has made an enormous down payment on clean energy through the passage over the last few years of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Infrastructure Law in particular delivered a range of new authorities and financial resources to DOE to focus on commercialization, something that our own project here at BPC, the American Energy Innovation Council, is quite excited about given our decade of focus on these ideas. And these federal programs have resulted in renewed enthusiasm, lots of commercial activity, and many announcements for new investments in energy projects across America. But our path forward is not yet clear as we think about ensuring the pace and ambition of this effort matches the scale of the challenge or the size of the opportunity. So today we'll hear from longtime private sector experts as well as the Department of Energy's newly minted Undersecretary for Infrastructure who oversees this expanded agenda at DOE. And I will note that literally right now at the Department of Energy, David Crane is being sworn in as the first Undersecretary for Infrastructure. And we are thrilled that he has elected to come here to BPC as his first act. So let's hope he makes it here on time. We're all counting on that, and we're really excited about having him here. So given the dynamic with David's schedule, we're going to start with our panel conversation first. It will be moderated by my colleague Tanya Das, who leads our innovation program at BPC. And then we'll turn to a fireside chat with David once he arrives. So for now, I'll turn it over to Tanya. Thanks, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sasha. We're so excited for this event. I cannot believe I get to share the stage with these three incredible human beings. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm going to kick things off by doing a quick introduction. I mean, these three people really need no introduction, but for formality's sake, we'll do that. We'll jump into some questions, and I'm hoping to reserve some time at the end for questions from the audience, so please start thinking about what you all want to ask these folks. So to kick things off, we have Norm Augustine. Norm Augustine is the retired chairman and CEO of the Lockheed Martin Corporation, former Undersecretary of the Army, and co-chair of the Bipartisan Policy Center's American Energy Innovation Council, which we'll talk about more in a moment. He's had a very long, successful career driving American innovation for defense, national security, and intelligence purposes. He started his career as a research engineer in the private sector in 1958 and served as Undersecretary of the Army under President Gerald Ford in 1973. He later founded InQtel, an intelligence-focused venture capital firm that seeks to support U.S. intelligence by investing in advanced technology. He's been involved in countless influential boards and commissions. I'm not going to list all of them here. There's too many. But on top of all of this, he holds an impressive 27 honorary degrees. So welcome, Norm. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Tom Steyer. Tom is the co-executive chair of Galvanized Climate Solutions, a climate-focused global investment firm focused on the climate transition. He brings a wealth of knowledge from 3 decades in the global investment business. In 1986, he founded Faleron Capital Management, a hedge fund based in San Francisco, and during his time there until 2012, he led the organization's growth from overseeing $6 million to $36 billion. Really impressive. After leaving that organization, he turned his attention to philanthropy and public service with a focus on climate change and renewable energy. In 2013, he founded Next Gen America, an environmental advocacy nonprofit and political action committee. He is active in state and national politics and ran as a candidate for the 2020 presidential nomination, and later co-chaired President Biden's Climate Engagement Advisory Council. Following the campaign, he founded Galvanize in 2021. And last but not least, we hear that you drive a 2016 Chevy Volt hybrid vehicle, is that right?
Actually turned it in for an electric Mustang.
Fabulous, even better. Excellent. And lastly, we have Chad Holliday. Chad is the former chairman of Royal Dutch Shell and Bank of America and former CEO of DuPont. He is the other co-chair of BPC's American Energy Innovation Council. He brings a long career of business acumen and innovative thought leadership to our work on AEIC. As the CEO of DuPont, he established a sustainable growth goal aiming to increase shareholder value while also decreasing DuPont's environmental footprint. As a result, DuPont transitioned from solely a chemical company to a science-based products and services company. After retiring from DuPont, Chad joined the board of directors and Bank of America and was elected chairman the following year. He also has an extremely impressive list of affiliations that we're not going to go through here. We don't have enough time. But an interesting note about Chad, earlier in his career, he spent 6 years in Tokyo as president of DuPont Asia Pacific, which is really neat. So as you can tell from the backgrounds of the 3 folks we have up here, they have such a big wealth of knowledge on things relating to the private sector, to climate change, to innovation. We have so much to discuss here. And I wanted to start off by talking about the AEIC. I told the audience a little bit about the American Energy Innovation Council. This organization was founded back in 2010, has been a project of BPC since then. Norm and Chad were founding members, as well as several other CEOs at the time. And back in 2010, it was a very, very different moment for energy innovation. We had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which had just passed, but we also had Waxman-Markey legislation that had just failed. Our nation was just emerging from the Great Recession. So fast forward to today, where Congress has passed landmark legislation that's put a really big down payment on energy innovation. I would love to hear from you both, what has changed in that time from day one of AEIC to today, as well as your perspectives on what drew you to devote your time to AEIC and how successful you think the effort has been. Norm, would you like to go first?
Be happy to. Let me say at the start that I can think of hardly a more important topic to not only our country, but to the world. And so I'm happy to be here and be part of this. As you said, it was 2010 when the AEIC opened its doors for business. That was a time, and I want to set the stage for the change here. At that time, if my memory is correct, the carbon concentration in the atmosphere was around 380 parts per million. The temperature rise above pre-industrial times was about 1.0 degrees centigrade. As you said, the AARA had just been passed. One of the things that was particularly promising that had just been passed at that time, or just created, I should say, was ARPA-E as part of the Department of Energy. ARPA-E had been proposed 2 years earlier as part of a study that was done by the National Academies. And it was just getting on its way, and the Academy's proposal was that within 5 years it should have $1 billion a year budget. Needless to say, that's not happened. Progress has been made, but we're way short of what was originally proposed. There were a lot of skeptics at that time. There was skepticism, is the Earth really warming? And to those who agreed that it was warming, there was those who said, well, should we be worried about it even if it is warming? And there were those who were really skeptical that human activity could have any important part of all this. With that kind of as a background, there were 7 of us, I guess, who were CEOs of reasonably large organizations. And we were all very worried individually. We just talked to each other, and we were worried about where we were headed and that this could be an existential issue for the country and for the world. And we began to wonder, I should say, I think all of us, Chad, were not in the energy business specifically. We were outsiders, but we were trying to figure out how can we help. And so someone, it was not I, got the idea we should form the AEIC, which we did. And a word about what we did. In those early years, we began putting out reports. We went over to Congress and pounded the halls. We sat with individual members of both the House and the Senate. And Chad, you may remember we ran a bunch of newspaper ads that were, they were full-page ads in a bunch of the newspapers. And they featured right in the middle of the picture a great big bowl of potato chips. And you might say, what does potato chips have to do with the AIC? Well, the caption said, Americans spend more money on potato chips than they do on energy and climate change research and development. And that did get a few people's attention. I think it was helpful. It was probably better than some profound statement. But that's what we did. And we focused on a number of things. One of the things that we focused on was properly funding ARPA-E, getting it to $1 billion a year quickly. And ARPA-E obviously was formatted after ARPA in the Department of Defense, DARPA these days. Another thing we focused on at that time was innovation that was really produced major changes, not just qualitative, the small stuff that was already going on. And we had a lot to say about nuclear fusion, which at that time was kind of a dream. And I can come back to that if we have any time. But people worked on it a long time, and the progress was, let's just say it was hard to come by. And the other thing we focused on quite a bit early on was a concern that in most technical fields, people have talked about the valley of death, which basically is the difficulty of getting from an idea to a prototype or a laboratory demonstration that the idea has merit. Well, in most things you work with, once you've gotten over that valley of death, you're in business. Well, one of the problems with energy is that once you've got a laboratory prototype, you're a long way from knowing whether you can scale that to where it's useful. And perhaps more importantly, or part of that is it economically viable? And we thought that the government needed a mechanism to demonstrate that you can get over that second valley of death, which has taken ideas from the laboratory really to the private sector. And what's the government's role? And so I'll just fast forward, wrap up here quickly, but fairly quickly. Go forward 13 years as we sit here. We're now at 1.1 degrees centigrade surface temperature. We're at 420 parts per million of carbon, and that's continuing to increase even today. One thing is we've got the public's attention better, and I don't claim any particular credit for that, but I will say there's nothing like standing up to your waist in a flood or watching your house burn down or watching your house blow away, as happened to us on Sanibel Island, to convince you that something's going on. And people are much more accepting today of the idea that there is a problem, that we need to be doing something about it, and we better get on with it pretty quickly. Of course, in the middle of this period, from then to now, we had the Paris Agreement, worked toward 1.5 degrees for sure. Don't go above 2 degrees centigrade. And one of the things that happened in this period that was an accomplishment was the CHIPS and Science Act. But I mentioned that with a degree of caution. There was a difference between the CHIPS part and the science part that a lot of people don't recognize for some reason. The CHIPS part was funded. The science part was mostly IOUs. And so we need to have another meeting 5 years from now to see how the science part worked out. It's off to a start, put it that way. And another thing that's happened, this is obviously a global problem that if the United States went to zero carbon emissions, there'd still be 87% as much as there is without our doing that. This is the global problem. And globally, we're much less inclined to cooperate with each other today than we were 13 years ago. At that time, the Cold War was essentially over. China was not the threat that it is today in many regards. And so it's going to be all the harder to do things that require global cooperation. I think maybe one of the more significant gains, and I'll close with this, is that this idea that we need a way to get over the second valley of death. We'll hear more about that today, but the basic assumption here is that industry has got to be the ultimate user. I think industry owns a little over 90% of the energy assets in this country. And so the government can do a lot, needs to take a lead, but somehow we've got to get into industry, the advancements that are being made, and there are some. And so our idea was how do you take out of the government bureaucracy a means of supporting industry so that industry will also invest, and that you take ideas from laboratories, from prototypes to full-scale demonstrations to where industry could safely go into the business of applying these things. And that has, I would say, made a lot of progress. The difficulty is you're fighting bureaucracy. We could talk about that all day, so I'm going to quit there.
Thanks, Norm. I want to dig into some of the things you mentioned in a moment. You did a great job just setting up, where we are today, as well as touching on some of the challenges we're facing with global cooperation and where we're at in our comfort as a nation in collaborating with allies, but also in addressing current threats. I'd love to return to that in a moment. Before we go there, I would love to hear from Chad. We heard some reflections from Norm about why AEIC was created, what has happened since then, what's different between then and now. I'd love to hear from you is this really a sea change for energy innovation? The government has now spent billions and billions of dollars on research and development, as well as later stage, including demonstrations and deployments. Hundreds of billions of dollars in loan authorities have been granted. So there's a lot of money on the table. But do you think that's going to translate to the changes we need to see? What feels different about this moment or the same even in 2010?
Well, thanks, and thanks for having us. It's just a great event, and the Bipartisan Policy Center sticking with this all this time, which is why we're here. Believe me, because every time Norm and I would start to doze off, they'd call up and say, "Get back to work." So it was really good. I think you set it up. We can spend the money. There's no question about that. We get the result, and so that's why the next speaker, David Crane, when he comes, is very important because he's got to make that right. And I think it's just a great pick for that. I'd like to, if I could, go back and put a little more color commentary. Norm gave the facts. Now I'll give the background. So I recall when the idea of this group. We didn't have a name at the time, by the way. It's just a group. I was in the Ronald Reagan building. I was starting down the escalator, and I got a cell phone call, and they had this idea. Let's get together 6 to 8 business leaders and solve the energy problem here in the U.S. And I was about halfway down the escalator, and he said, "We can get Bill Gates." I said, "Oh, you get Bill Gates, I'll be there." So that was at the end of the escalator. and quite frankly, I said, "Well, I can set that one aside." It'll never happen. Well, they got Bill Gates, and they got Norm, and they got some great people. But what we were doing in that first 6 months that I think is very instructive for right now. There were 7 of us, and no publicity. It was all confidential. But we were really trying to ask ourselves the question: can it be done? Is it reasonable to ask the economy to make this investment? Will it work? Is the technology there? And as we get to a tough spot. I remember Bill Gates in particular said, "Well, let's get the 2 best experts in the world, get them in here, and let them debate it. Let's decide." And we did that a couple times. And we had a great advisory panel. No one, and we all came from different industries, was ever representing their industry. I don't remember anybody said, "This is what we need," or "that we need." In fact, it was much more about the answer. I think the answer to your question, if we get people around the table that aren't representing their industry or their particular point of life, and they're really listening to the right experts, we got a real shot at this. Now, I got to say, once we got that and we concluded, yes, it could be done, then we started to say, well, okay, how much is it going to be nuclear and how much is it going to be wind, how much is it going to be solar? We couldn't agree on that. And I think that was probably good. To me, that was encouraging because it said, oh, there's a lot of ways we can get there. So if this one doesn't work, there's another one that will work. So it was in good shape. Then we put together this plan, which is what was really, Norm really helped us a lot on this, the valley of death. Because you can get the great technology, but if you can't get the demonstration projects up, and that's what we're celebrating, I think, later today, some of that process to do it. So that's why we came out with our report the way it was. I recall the day we were able to come and present it to President Obama. We were around at different meetings with different people. We go into some group, I won't say who, and they would hear us out politely and say, well, I got to go to another meeting. It's 10 minutes, they're gone. So it was, we could say we probably didn't sell it, but we were there. And then just before we were going to go see the president, we were supposed to meet with a bunch of people from the House, but somehow that had been canceled. So we didn't have a place to sit. So we knew the meeting room where we were supposed to meet. So we'll just sit here, it should be available. So we're sitting there, then all of a sudden these people start coming in, And I remember I nudged Bill and I said, hey, I think we're in their meeting room, I have to get out of here. And then it turned out they hadn't gotten the word the meeting was canceled. So we had the best dialogue of the whole time because I said, Bill, you better say something here. They won't hear you because they know you. They asked questions about our process. It was a fantastic meeting. They gave you, and this was equal balance between the R's and the D's. This was not partisan anyway. If we can repeat that kind of atmosphere with this kind of money being funded, I think we got a real shot. Because the technology, where solar is today, where wind is today, where I think where nuclear could be today, is so much different than it was 13 years ago when we were doing that work. So I'm quite encouraged.
I'm really glad to hear that. Thanks, Chad. So turning now to you, Tom, you've worn a lot of different hats in your lifetime. You've been involved in climate advocacy, you've been involved as an investor and as a philanthropist, to name a few. And we've heard from Norm and Chad about what the government has done and all the work it's taken to get to this point, which is a significant amount of work. But from all your experiences, you know what makes money. You know what it takes to make things commercial. You know what it takes to get things to be profitable. And the private sector is ultimately going to have to drive this transition. They're going to be the ones on the receiving end of the money that the government is spending. So my question for you is, what do you think the private sector needs to do in this moment to really step up? And what are the challenges that we're likely to see in the coming years as this money is being spent?
So thanks, Tanya. And I do want to thank these two gentlemen on either side of me for the work they've been doing over the last 13 years in terms of pushing for energy innovation. I do think we're at a completely different stage than we were 13 years ago. Chad was referring really to the incredible innovation that has happened, and in terms of the costs coming down in a dramatic fashion across the clean energy spectrum. So that's not just solar and wind, but it's also batteries and EVs. And so when we think about what has to be done now, I'd like to break it down, if we could, into deploying the existing technologies that are basically mature. They're going to get a lot better. They're going to get a lot cheaper. The technology curves are continuing to work and basically make these the dominant energy technologies, but they're deployable right now. So what is the problem with getting out all of the huge number of wind, solar, battery, EV projects that are on the books? And the answer is permitting, access to the grid, having enough people to do it, and market structures. So there's real human existing problems in the physical world that make making huge projects very difficult to do in the United States of America, because we have a lot of regulations that make it difficult to put out hundreds of billions of dollars into new projects. Having said that, I believe on that scale, with the people in the government working as hard as they are, with people in civil society working as hard as they are, that in fact those technologies in this decade will become the dominant technologies. And that will, when we think about where we are in 2030 or 2033, we will say the exact same things that Norm and Chad said, which is it's completely different now. The prices have crossed. We'll be looking at a completely different energy world from that standpoint. I think that there's much more, though. That is the basic part of the tax credits of the IRA. Then let's talk about the kinds of things that Norm was talking about, where we have the technology, but we don't have broad market acceptance. And those are places where, in a lot of those, we're going to be facing the same challenges about getting to scale, getting to drive down that cost curve, getting the number of repetitions so that, in fact, people do it faster, better, cheaper, and what the government can do to enable that. And there's a lot of programs in place, but that is going to be challenging. But let me say this, as someone who looks at technology innovations at this level that can be impactful in the next decade, people are doing an amazing job. There is an amazing group of people. I mean, I said the costs have dramatically changed in clean energy since 2010. That is absolutely true. So has the level of human capability in this sector. The number of people, whether they're repeat CEOs, entrepreneurs, venture money, young people coming out of college, grad school, or just wanting to work in these areas, it's fantastic. So our ability to do this in this second level that I would say, companies that have the technology but need product market fit, need to scale, that is going to be so much better than people broadly know that I think it's going to knock people's socks off. I think the last thing is what I would describe as deep tech. I mean, we were talking about, I think Chad was really talking about fission, nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion is something that could have a huge impact, but it's not going to happen in the next decade. I mean, we could talk about how long it's going to take. Just so you know, I invested in nuclear fusion in 2006, personally, and I'm hoping to get it. There are 12 companies pursuing nuclear fusion in a very serious way, and I'm in one of them. I hope it's the one. But let me just say this. The question here is, how does the private sector bring the money, the expertise, the talent to bear in these different phases? But I think you have to go back to what Norm was saying. What Norm said is this is a global problem. The United States, we want to cut our emissions in half. Okay. I mean, my number is a little different from Norm's. I think we're 11% of the emissions. So if we cut it in half, it's still not getting us to heaven. When we think about how this is going to work, if you look at the global projections about emissions, the so-called developed world, people are looking at dramatic reductions over the next decade. But there are a lot of countries in this world that don't have a lot of electricity or energy, and they're going to size up multiples. India's supposed to have 5x the electricity generation in 2050 they have now. There are countries in this world with 100 million people, like the DRC, that only 10% of the people have electricity. They're going to size up 10x. So when we think about what the United States' role in this global transition is, okay, we have to develop and drive down these cost curves and have technology that is available to the people in those countries so that it's a good deal for them to do clean. Mm-hmm. It's a good deal for them to build the structures that will not emit, that will obviously I'll just say this is the last thing I was going to say, which is there's a huge issue in all of this between the global north and the global south. And when we think about what the United States' role can be in this to try and diminish the animus and the resentment that people in the global south, who are suffering more than people in the global north, but who have produced a fraction of the emissions, it's going to be, as we develop the technology, as we make it available, we're going to have to make sure that, in fact, that they are at the table, that they are part of the decision-making process, and that it's in their interest, because they are not feeling as if the way this has worked is one that works that is fair, and that we're going to have justice in our mind as we proceed on for business to drive this out.
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to unpack that last point a bit more, because I think it's really important. we are at a really interesting moment with the US right now where we have this big opportunity, economic opportunity for as a nation to export everywhere. We talk about building here, exporting everywhere. But we also have some really important tensions with other countries. Sometimes it feels like we're entering a new Cold War with the government of the People's Republic of China, and we are in the middle of figuring out how that's all going to play out. Chad, I'd love to know from you in particular, having led DuPont in an international setting with your work there, what do you think needs to happen? How can the U.S. support these investments in developing countries while also advancing our own economic interests? Because I think in order for this to be done in a bipartisan way, the two of those goals need to be married together.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for bringing up the 800 million people that don't have electricity. By the way, it's down from 1 billion, so it's a little bit of progress. But if we think we're going to, take care of our needs and not find a way to get their needs, it's just not going to work. And so it's very, very high priority, and it can be done. There are processes to do that. And I think I've done a lot of work in the past with the UN in Africa, and they skipped a generation of phones. They didn't go through the landlines. They went. The same thing can be done here. We just have to find and to some extent, it's issues between individual countries that are a big factor in doing that. But I think if we go through this transition without dealing with that, we have a major problem. Now, I've done a lot of work in China. And this is not a political statement, but what I find is if you bring something to China that China likes, they got a place for you. So I think we got to find a way to work with all the countries of the world, including China. They're so big, they're so important. And I would not let the current skirmish get in the way. I was in with a premier, I won't say his name, and he was talking about something that was going to happen soon. And I said, well, how soon is soon? He said, very soon. I said, well, how soon is very soon? Maybe 20 years. So I think there is a longer time horizon, and there's some things they could do different, but I think we have to work our way through that. But I always want to go back to Tom's basic point, that we can't do this without thinking about all the people of the world in the way we go about it.
Yeah, we have one atmosphere. We're one Earth, exactly, yeah. Anything else you'd like to add, Norm or Tom, to that?
If I may, one thing I want to add is that Chad made a very important point that I would like to affiliate myself with that I forgot to make, and that was the BPC, Bipartisan Policy Council, really was our partner through this. And the AEIC might not even exist today had it not been for the BPC, and so I've got to give some credit where credit is due. I'd love to tag on to Tom's comment about nuclear. The council, from the very beginning, began saying that we need some huge breakthroughs, that we're not going to get there by getting a few more steps, little gains out of the stuff we're working on. We're clearly making progress, but it's not going to be the whole answer. And so we started saying, what are the big answers? Well, one of the big answers in our mind was nuclear fusion. And fission also being an important part, but since Fukushima, which happened the year after we formed our group, has set us way back in that area. We can come back to that. But in the fusion area, you amused me because when I was in college and graduate school, they were working on the Matterhorn project at Princeton. And I went out one day to talk to them. I was an aerospace engineer. I didn't know anything about energy. Don't know much today. But anyway, I went out to talk to them about what they were doing. And one of my questions was, well, how long will it be till we have electricity on the grid that's produced by fusion? And they said 30 years. Well, about 5 years, that was in 1959. So about 3, 4, 5 years ago, I was doing a project for the Department of Energy, and I went out at Livermore, and they were showing me all the good work going on there. And I said, how long will it be till I have electricity on the grid to drive by fusion? And they said 30 years. And I remember my comment was, well, at least we haven't lost any time. But the fact is that
Hey, that's not funny, Norm.
I didn't invest. I didn't invest. But the good news is the following. There's MIT has a program in energy, of which fusion is a part. And the meeting a year ago, there were half a dozen speakers who were mostly from industry, some from government, but who were truly involved in day-to-day work in fusion. And I decided I was going to pin them down. I wasn't going to leave till they were done. And so my question was the same question as before. And I said, I want a year. This is for the first watt of energy, of power that comes off the grid. And it's not supplying America or the world. But anyway, I said, when is the first one? They said 2012. That was the number that they all agreed on. There are a lot of companies, as you mentioned, that are spending a lot of money.
A lot.
That have a lot of confidence in this. And so I think there's a real potential here. We need a breakthrough. We need a plan B. I don't think we're going to get there today doing what we're doing.
Thanks.
So let me just, I wanted to get back a little bit to China and a little bit to the north-south. I mean, I just want to make one point on the north-south, which is last year, Pakistan did have these epic floods and 33 million people were displaced. So that's about a third of the people. There are about 100 million people, I think, in Pakistan. 33 million people displaced. They had produced 1/10 of the cumulative emissions over time. So when you think about people who feel as if it isn't quite right, there's at least 33 million people on this planet who feel like somehow this didn't work out the way that they thought was completely fair. But I also want to talk about China because, look, when we're talking about a clean energy revolution, and we're talking about the IRA, and we're talking about all these different acts, the people who are deploying the most capital into clean energy by far are the Chinese. The people who are buying the most EVs, solar panels, wind turbines. I know everybody talks about the coal spending in China, that they're building a lot of new coal plants, which is true. But they're spending 10 times that amount of money in clean energy. They are permitting things faster than we're permitting them. They are driving down the cost curves faster than we're driving down the cost curves. So when we think about what's going on, this is a big global thing that the United States needs to use our strengths to be a productive and valuable leader in, because we for sure know that our biggest rival is spending a lot more money and working diligently in every single one of the areas, batteries, EVs, solar, wind, and will continue to do so. We have to use our strengths. And I actually disagree with Norm on this. I believe there'll be a revolution this decade where when we look back, we will see that we're on a complete, if we're not, we're in a lot of trouble. If we don't have a revolution this decade in terms of energy usage and emissions, we will be in a desperate shape because it's a cumulative problem. So I am betting that actually the people of the world and the people of this country are going to be able to dramatically change the costs and the efficiency of our energy system. And it's going to go across the board. It's going to put us in a position to be safe and healthy. I absolutely believe that, but I better be right.
Oh, I really appreciate that optimism. I think with that, we'll turn to questions from the audience. If y'all wouldn't mind raising your hands, and we should have one of our colleagues running a mic to you. Yeah.
My name is Jack Bagley, and I worked on the Hill with Mike McCormick. This is another fusion anecdote. And he was the author of the Magnetic Fusion Energy Research Development Act of 1980. and that had as its goal $20 billion for R&D over 20 years for ignition. So that's another notch of not working very well. My question is, a lot of statements about what industry can do, but as you know, over time, the government keeps going like this on energy support, energy R&D support, including today with the House bill, which basically gutted the clean energy budget that was proposed. So we don't make progress like we could, because over the last 40 years, it's been up and down with new administrations, new philosophies, et cetera. How does the council try to help educate is probably not the right word, but inform these decision makers who are not thinking about the larger issue.
I guess you could run for president.
That would be a suicide mission.
Let me answer, but I think the private sector's got a job to do here. The government's got the toughest job of all. Let's don't kid ourselves. It's very difficult here. But I think when the private sector in the home states of elected representatives goes and sees them and says, here's what we can do, here's what's necessary, here's the projects we can do, we can make this happen, it has great credibility. So I really look to the private sector to do their job and step up and say this can be done, because we're starting to see the light. We can see it. It's going to happen. And the government funding will go up and down. I understand that. That shouldn't be a reason for the private sector not to keep the case. But if I could ask a question.
Yes, sir.
I admire you greatly for your run and the stance you took when you did it. What did you learn by doing that?
So I learned a very simple thing going around the country, which is the American people are awesome. And I'm not saying that to be polite or namby-pamby or anything else. Regardless of their political philosophy, Americans are fantastic. And we should not be scared of each other or vilify each other. Across the board, I absolutely enjoyed my interaction with Americans, including people who absolutely disagreed with me. And I could tell you a funny story about it, but I don't think I have the time. But I will say this. I believe I also feel as if structurally the elite institutions that run our society are not necessarily serving our society well at this point. And I felt very agitated about that, because I feel as if the American people are absolutely fantastic. And it was an absolute joy and a privilege to hang with them for a while, honestly. And it's such an education, biggest privilege of my life probably. So I'm not backing off on America at all. Au contraire. I absolutely believe in this group of people and what we can accomplish together.
Oh, could you say more about those elite institutions, how we fix them?
Well, I mean, you can see, I can't tell you how to fix them. I can say, you can look at our inability to get stuff through Congress, that the partisan divide being so broad, the vilification of each of the sides, where something, the American tradition, in my opinion, is we argue. I always say to people, we are a loud and vulgar people, and thank God for that. We argue, we express our opinions, we raise our voices, we make a compromise, we solve the issue, and we move on. No hard feelings. That's the American tradition that I subscribe to. Loud, vulgar, argumentative, productive, practical.
That's a very bipartisan message.
Supporting your viewpoint, there's examples of where when Americans really decide there's a problem and we do have to get together. As I said, I'm an aerospace type. We built 96,000 airplanes per year in World War II, in the highest point. We put 12 of my friends on the moon within the decade, got them all back alive. I mean, who would have bet that was possible?
And we also built no passenger cars in those years in World War II.
Yeah, that's right. And so then, since we've been talking about it, just touch quickly on China. My first trip to China was in 1978, and I was there as part of a little mission to look at their aerospace industry as a guest of the PRC's government. And when I'd walk down the street, crowds, maybe 50, 60 people would follow me, not threatening, but just curious what this animal was that's walking down the street. And people would come up to me, and those who spoke a little English, I guess they had heard that Westerners were all wealthy. One of the questions I would get periodically, how many bicycles do you own? And contrast that with today, where China has taken more people from the poverty to the middle class than there are Americans to take anywhere. And so I think there's great optimism. If we can pull together, China's shown they can do it if they decide to, and they're working on it. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. My concern is that going at the rate we're going, we're unlikely to make 1.5 degrees or maybe even 2 degrees on the time scales we're talking about. We need a plan B. And to me, plan B is nuclear fusion and it's atmospheric carbon removal. And hopefully we'll spend some money on that.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a last burning question.
Hi, my name is Raj Lakiani. I am a venture capitalist, investor, and energy technology CEO. I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley. I worked for a corporate VC. And I've seen the boom and bust cycles, particularly in clean tech. So I would say that the government funding also is in parallel with the private sector and that they go bust as well. And I'm curious where your thoughts are about, interest rates kind of going up and kind of creating another bust cycle. And then also, in my life, as far as risk management / hitting my midlife crisis, I'm trying to see parts of the world, see the glaciers and things like that. I spent a month in Brazil, and I was really just disturbed to see, the amount of deforesting going on, grazing land to, for cattle, and I just wonder why we're not doing kind of more obvious things for mitigation. Like just paying indigenous people to live so they don't have to tear down the rainforest, like just really common sense stuff, like, soft tech, low tech versus high tech, right? People have diabetes, instead of injecting insulin, why not just eat less, right? Like just basic common sense things. Why aren't we doing that? Thank you.
Do you want to comment for me? Please. Well, first of all, your basic point about the natural world being you were saying it was disturbing. It is disturbing. I think the numbers on the Brazilian rainforest or the Amazon rainforest the estimates are, if you go somewhere around 20 to 23% deforestation, it basically changes the nature of that carbon sink and turns it into a grassland. And it's a little more complicated than that. And we're somewhere around 19 to 20% deforested. So when you look at the world and think about where we are, it's where we are, but it's also the trajectory that we're on. And that is one of the probably 7 to 10 tipping points that are pretty scary. And when you see them, you have to ask. The natural world is sending us very strong signals. For those of you who read the science journals in 2023 about the pace of warming, the pace of melt in Greenland, the pace of melt in, West Antarctica, it's scary. I will also say, though, that this is a different time, that those signals, Norm said, people think differently because if your house blows away, you think differently. The natural world is having events and will continue to have cascading events that will change people's minds and change the attitude about the boom and bust cycle, that we can't afford a boom and bust cycle. I deeply believe that. I also believe the costs have moved where, from a deployment standpoint, there are real political issues. I see David Crane just walked in. There are real issues. But the fact is, I believe we will overcome those issues and do a ton of deployment. And I believe the technology will be better than people understand in multiple different technologies, in multiple industries around the world that will, in fact, let us bend this curve in a very substantial way and have the kind of technology S-curve that we've seen in technologies for hundreds of years when a dominant technology gets past.
I love the optimism on this stage. That's fantastic. It's helping me with my own personal midlife crisis right now. I think we're going to end on that note, and we'll turn it back over to Sasha so we can get the next conversation started. Y'all, if you wouldn't mind, stay seated.
Stay.
Just stay for now.
Thank you. I botched
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Norm. It's great to see you.
All right, that was
Oh, jeez.
what a nice setup for the next part of the program today. Really thrilled that newly minted Undersecretary of Infrastructure, David Crane, is with us now. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to try to move quickly into the next part of the conversation. So I'll just really briefly do a quick introduction here. David Crane was the director until about 25 minutes ago of the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And in that role, he was really in charge of the new program that he'll tell us more about here in the next few minutes that is being set up to really drive forward commercialization and demonstration of advanced energy technologies here in this country. But in his new role, he oversees not only OSED, but DOE's Loan Programs Office and a number of other important programs, really with a broad focus and mandate for demonstrating and deploying clean energy infrastructure, achieving energy affordability and reliability, and enhancing the American manufacturing base in the energy sector. And he brings really a unique perspective to this role, having had a long career in the business sector in clean energy, sustainability, and in climate change. He spent over a decade as CEO of NRG, where he took the company from Chapter 11 to Fortune 200. And in that role, he was really on the forefront of next generation clean energy development through large-scale initiatives in utility-scale renewables, residential solar, carbon capture, and EV fast charging, just to name a few. There's a long list of other things we can do to talk about his background, but because of the timing and really, I think, of where the conversation was before Undersecretary Crane arrived, I think we should just move into the next part of the program and the conversation. We'll have a chat and hopefully leave some time for questions. David needs to leave at around 5:15, so we're going to try to make this as efficient as possible. But before we dive into our fireside chat, I believe we have a special presentation from our previous panelists that we'd like to make to Undersecretary Crane.
So we have this for you. We have a little cake.
We have a cake.
Oh, thank
On your
you.
new position.
That's
And let's just give a round of applause.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you very much. Should I accept it? Should I hold it here for the entire
Well,
time?
we'll serve it later, but we
Okay.
wanted to
Wait, can I get
acknowledge
a
the
picture
moment.
with you with the,
Yeah.
is there, yeah. Allison. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
And our panelists wanted to offer you some pieces for advice.
Pieces of cake.
Pieces of cake.
Advice.
A
Okay.
few nuggets of wisdom before we jump into the next section. Norm, why don't we start with you?
Oh, pieces of wisdom, I guess, advice. One of the things I would suggest is that you condition the world that within your scope of responsibilities, there will be some failures. And don't spend your time picking at the failures in the past and forming the firing squad. Let's get on with all the things that are going to succeed.
Tom?
So my oldest son is 35, and he was a grad student in comp sci at Stanford. And David Crane convinced him to go to work at NRG because he is that inspirational a person. So what I would say to David Crane is keep being that inspirational person for young people to really make sure that this revolution happens.
Thank you, Tom. Chad?
David, you've been preparing your whole life for this job. You've had the right training, the right experience. Go do what you think is right. And you call on all your friends from the private sector and insist they help you make it happen.
All right, with that, thank you to our panelists.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Tom.
All the best to you.
Thanks, Norm.
We can take these middle seats.
You.
Yeah.
I just have to say, these three gentlemen are all my my heroes and my role models. So that advice is, thank you.
Well, that's great. And really, congratulations on the recent confirmation. And really, we really appreciate you coming here as really your first act in the role. We're excited about what you're up to and want to hear more about what your priorities are. And really, just to kick things off, I'd love to give you a little bit of space to talk about your priorities. I think in terms of framing, you've got now one of the most exciting, interesting, and important jobs in the clean energy industry anywhere in the world. You've got a huge balance sheet, war chest, and mandate to deploy capital in some really interesting and exciting and complicated areas. What are your priorities?
Well, thank you, and it is true, and I don't want anyone to think that, like, being undersecretary now for 31 minutes has gone to my head, and that like I'm like one of those guests on the Johnny Carson show that, doesn't wait to listen to the other guests, but I do have my whole family waiting back at the Department of Energy, and it's very important to me to stay married no matter what happens to the climate.
We support that.
So, but in terms of priorities, a lot of the money that we're operating in my end of the DOE, which I would call the commercialization end of the DOE, is set up to be public-private partnerships. And one of my perceptions as someone who comes from the private sector is that public-private partnerships is always something that people in the public sector like to talk about, as opposed to people in the private sector. My company, that was NRG, we were the largest recipient of money from the Department of Energy under the financial stimulus back in 11 or 12 or whenever it was. And we were trying to do this carbon capture project in Texas, and it was $1 billion project, and we couldn't make the numbers work. But if it was $200 million cheaper, we could make it work. And they came to me and said, the Department of Energy will give us $200 million. I said, I will only take that money if it's the last money on Earth. And they came back a week later and said, it's the last money on Earth. So one of the things is, as we approach public-private partnerships, because it's sort of 50-50 cost sharing for these emerging clean energy technologies, hydrogen, new nuclear, carbon capture, long-duration energy storage, and then a program that I really want to talk about, industrial decarbonization. I want to make it the best private partnership, and part of that is we've introduced something I call the credo, where it's transparency, it's replicability, it's urgency, it's shared success, and it's timeliness. And you'll see 2 of those 5, timeliness and urgency, have to do with speed, because the private sector historically has moved a lot faster than the government, but that's not the case. And if there's anyone in the room who thinks that they've got time to just ponder whether they want to work with the government, you are sadly mistaken. Like, just in the office I'm in now, said, we have $26 billion. We have $20 billion of active solicitations out there right now. All that money, the people will be selected by the end of the year. And so the government is moving fast. The government, I believe, is moving at private sector speed. And so, it's time to put up or shut up.
It's really interesting. That's a massive change in culture, I think, right? To really start to pick up the pace in that way. But I think it meets the moment, right? That's what needs to be done right now.
Well, can I just say something? Like, people are like, oh man, how are you going to change the culture of a place like the Department of Energy? It's like 120,000 employees, government pace. We were doing a hydrogen solicitation in the fall. It started, people had to put in a concept paper by November 7th to qualify. Like a week before they were due, we got a letter from 12 governors, the vast majority of which were Democratic governors, and they said, look, will you delay, your deadline? And of course, all these departments have government relations people, intergovernmental relations. They're all like, oh, of course we're going to do that. I'm like, hell no. We're not going to do that, and we didn't delay. And then when we announced final bids were due on April 7th, we announced, we did a webinar, and 4 times in there I said, take April 7th seriously, because unless President Biden, in the form of John Podesta or Secretary Granholm, comes in my office and says, slow this down, I'm not slowing down for anything or anyone. And not a single entity tried to delay the final bid. So, culture, so it's not... Changing culture isn't actually as difficult as you just have to
stick to your guns.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. No, that's great. Well, and so would love to hear, how you're thinking about the various programs within the whole set of the infrastructure division at DOE, how they fit together. You said you wanted to say a few things about the industrial decarbonization work. You have OSED. There's LPO.
Yeah. And you mentioned LPO, and probably everyone in the room knows Jigar Shah.
We all know Jigar. He's sat in this. Stage.
As far as I have not actually met a human on the planet that doesn't know Jigar. And Jigar's line, which is true, is like all of what we're doing is private sector led and government enabled. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get Jigar because the David Crane is government enabled and government accelerated. And so industrial decarb is a good example. First of all, like we have this great hydrogen program. Everyone thinks that's like our flagship program, and I love it too and all. But there are lots of countries that have hydrogen programs, and for sort of historical reasons associated with past administrations, Democrat and Republican, we're actually a little bit behind on moving to the hydrogen future. So, and we will catch up. Don't be confused about that. But the industrial decarb, the $6.3 billion that we have under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for industrial decarb is a unique body of money. And I tend to believe, not to criticize any environmentalists in the room, Tom Steyer, but when environmentalists labeled, aluminum, steel, concrete, chemical, petrochemical as hard to abate sectors, they gave those industries sort of an easy pass to deep decarbonization in the 2030s, not the 2020s. And so, if you look at a great, some of the high-profile chemical companies, they all have like a four-part deep decarbonization. It starts with energy efficiency as much as we can get. Then we're going to electrify. We're going to depend on the electric industry to decarbonize the grid. And then around 2035, we're going to get to deep decarbonization of industrial heat. And then there'll be
And fuels, maybe.
yeah, and then the fourth step, there'll be a tail. There'll be like a 5 to 10% hyper hard to abate, and we'll plant trees or we'll do something. We'll do that in the 2040s. What we're trying to do with the $6.3 billion for industrial decarb is to bring that 2035 date for deep decarbonization of process heat into this decade. And so that if you still have a plan to do that in the 2030s, you're going to be left behind. And that's one of the things that, as a private sector person that I've tried to impart within the DOE is that, probably in my experience, probably the most overused cliche in corporate boardrooms in the U.S. is, our company is going to skate to where the puck is, because everyone wants to anticipate the future. So what's really important to us at the DOE is not just to, get this money deployed and we had Tom Steyer over today talking about how to deploy it intelligently. But we need to create an air of inevitability that these things are going to happen so that everyone's moving in the same direction. And like I said, that we play into, FOMO concerns that, someone thinks, because there are a lot of people that want to be in the middle of the pack.
Yeah, they want to do the fifth project, not the first one, right?
Yeah, and that's a separate issue, is how we make sure that first movers get first mover advantage. But but that's not to say we don't want fast followers. We just don't want a lot of slow moving laggards. And so to me, that's $6.3 billion because, U.S. is a post-industrial society, but heavy industry is 11% of carbon emissions. And then if you put heavy duty land transport, which is sort of a similar area, it's like heavy industry on wheels.
Yeah.
It's not just that that's a good chunk of the carbon that we have to abate, it's the hardest chunk. And so that's what the federal government, we can all talk about the flaws of federal government, but the United States government is the most powerful institution on the face of the earth. And now we have these extraordinary capabilities. And so my job is to make sure we deploy those capabilities to create this air of inevitability and then to make that a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's great. And that really builds on the conversation that we had just before you arrived, where there was a lot of optimism from this group right here around the moment that we're in right now and the new tools that are being given to the department to make this whole moment really a reality and really be able to build on it. And just on this topic of industrial decarbonization and hydrogen in particular, we're also at BPC really excited about the opportunities here and watching what the department is doing very carefully. Do you have all the tools you think in the toolkit to really make this happen? I mean, it feels to us that
it's so great that you asked that question because I was just saying to myself, no matter what question he asks me, I'm going to give him a particular answer, even if you asked me about the weather. But that was the cake. That's actually the question I'd like to answer. So I'm glad that you brought it up. So. Just being honest here, it's a new transparency in government. So the answer is again, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act. A private sector person that's done my share of criticism of the government, but it's pretty inspired legislation in terms of the stuff it's motivated, it's trying to incent. like I can say, oh, why did we get a pocket of money for geothermal or, something like that, a big, like one of our multi-billion. But it's good legislation, but the one thing about, the various provisions, and I gotta say, DOE, like if it's in the statute, like we do it exactly as the statute says. Like, we're like parsing the statute for individual words, but it mainly sort of incents supply.
Right. That was me, my question.
And the history of energy as a longtime energy person is that demand formation always lags supply because, as we used to say at Energy, no procurement officer, in any, energy consuming company ever got fired for buying energy this year the exact same way they bought it last year. But if you think about clean hydrogen, which is basically an all new energy product, demand's going to lag supply. If you read the liftoff reports that we at the DOE have been publishing on hydrogen and other things, which I commend, I think everyone should read because it's our attempt to be candid about the obstacles that we face in sort of full commercialization thing. It'll identify early term demand for clean hydrogen. And there's limits to what I can say, but we, with our friends at the White House and across, we're working on that.
Well, we did take note of that RFI that came out where you were sort of exploring.
Yeah, so there's more to come in that area soon.
That's great.
And to me, I'm also hoping that when we move as a government to address that, then people will say, oh, wow, this is a really different federal government. They're not just sort of, this isn't, they're not semi-oblivious to what's happening in the private sector. And so, it's definitely an all of government approach. And one of the things back to the heavy industry is concrete cement. Do people know how much of the concrete and cement, consumed in the United States is actually paid for by the United States government? 60%. There's real interest, led by John Podesta at the White House and all, in bringing to bear the power of government procurement. Having said that, if you parse through how concrete is actually procured, it's 4 steps of procurement away from those of us here in Washington. It's like the Federal Highway Authority gives money to the State Highway Authority, or to the state, who gives it to the State Highway Authority, who runs a solicitation for general contractors who then, buy cement. So we have to figure out how we break through, 4 layers of procurement. But look, if it was easy, it wouldn't be fun to do, right?
That's right. No, it's really exciting. And I just love your attitude of the air of inevitability. We sort of share that. And I think I speak for everyone in the room. We're really, really optimistic and enthusiastic for what you're doing. And I think there's a large community of people here that are going to be, they're helping DOE along the way as this process unfolds. I would love to.
Well, can I say one other thing,
Yes.
too? Because, you're at the Bipartisan Policy Center and you're here in Washington and, maybe you just work at the federal level. Policy remains important at the DOE because there are going to be gaps. There's, as Tom mentioned to our team today, the one thing you can be convinced is none of these, emerging clean energy, scale-ups are going to go exactly as you say. So we've got to be prepared. And an incredibly important tool is, federal policy, but state and local policy. I was also at the building council today, and we were talking about, and they're hyper focused on what municipalities are putting on them in terms of embedded carbon and things like that. And we really need to work with the states and local governments on creating markets for these things using mandates as well as the inducements we can provide. Not everything we're going to do, and to Norm's point, not everything we're going to do is going to work.
Right.
So, we've got to be prepared to try some things. I'm talking a lot about portfolio approach. Let's look at the portfolio here. If nothing we ever do, fails, then we didn't take enough chances.
Right. Then the DOE shouldn't have been doing it because it could have been handled by the private sector. Right. So it's really an all hands on deck moment. We need the private sector to step up, and we need municipalities, states, others to really get engaged here. Definitely think that's the right way to think about it. We have maybe time for one or two questions from the audience. If anyone wants to jump in and ask a question, we would welcome that. Yeah. Please say who you are as part of it. Thanks.
Sure. Hi, I'm Siri Hadreen. I'm a reporter with S&P Global. Asking about the money to lend under the LPO office. Do you have any internal deadlines to get all that money out? And is 2024 a change in administration? Is that a concern at all?
Well, so, I mean, LPO works on a rolling application process, which is a tremendous, virtue of their office. I'm not, they're not like, other parts where, some of our money evaporates, right, if it's not out of the door by 2026. I'm not sure if any of their loan authorities evaporate or not. But I would say, that, what Jigger and the loan program office are doing, and they have much more flexibility across basically every technology. What they're doing is great. I'd love to see it move, faster and be a little bit more streamlined because, there's a lot to do. In terms of, the first administration, ending, in January of 2025, as Secretary Granholm reminded all of us at my swearing in today, that's 402 business days from today. And so it's short, in the arc of climate change, it's a short amount of time, but,
a lot can get done.
Yeah, it's like, it's for me, to the fact it puts us all on a war footing and moving at impossible pace. We're not taking anything else for granted, and we're going to try and do a lot in those 402 days.
Any other questions? Well, I have one more then. I'll just jump in if we have a couple more minutes of your time. And that really gets at this we talked about it a little bit in the panel before and sort of gets at this 2025 question, which is the infrastructure law that gave DOE these new authorities and these new resources was bipartisan law. And we're really sort of encouraged by that sort of support that's inherent in the programs. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts as you're looking at it to the deployment of this capital and sort of the mandate of your office. How do we maintain that bipartisan support for the programs so that we can sort of try to minimize the risk that there will be shifts within within the DOE if there is a change in administration because the support for them is so strong?
Well, and let me predicate my answer by making one. I've actually been sort of stunned in my 9 months at DOE by what a non-political or apolitical place it is. Like it, when you're on the outside, living outside the Beltway, and you hear the stories about Washington, it's D's and R's at each other's throat, and there's just absolutely none of that at the DOE, and I guess my best answer to your question is that just based on the geographic distribution of where the bids are coming in from,
where the money will flow.
I think that should engender a lot of support. There's obviously serious job creation associated with the deployment of this capital, and I don't see it tilting overwhelmingly to the Democrats' blue states, right?
Right, that's right, blue.
So I think it's going to be very well, whether it's a blue or a red state is not any part of the evaluation. But again, we're
going to see a lot of projects across the country.
I mean, a lot of conservative states are energy-producing states with familiarity with the Department of Energy, and as a friend of mine from Houston said to me the other day, he goes, David, how Detroit is now sometimes referred to as the former auto capital of the world. Down here in Texas, we may or may not like renewables, but we do want to make sure that Houston is never not the energy capital of the world. So, and I think that one of the things that's not talked about, and again, people may differ about this, is traditional energy companies did not lean in on the first wave of renewable technology because, to be frank, it's too simple. I remember back in like 2009 asking the head of Siemens Power Generation, how are you going to play the solar revolution? And he said to me, David, the guy who paves your driveway is overqualified to install a solar plant. But the great thing about some of these new technologies, carbon capture and things like that, is it's complicated stuff. And some of it can use repurposed, infrastructure. So it's not just that, what's the term, enlightened self-interest. Mm-hmm. That we see the conventional players coming in heavy and with sincerity, and I think that's good for the overall future of the country and the future of the planet.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. We share that view, and we think it's a really encouraging sign for this next wave of the energy transition. Well, we promised you that we'd be finished at 5:15. I think we kept you a minute longer than that promise.
Well, it's just because I give long answers.
So first of all, congratulations again in your new role. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We really do appreciate it. And please join me in thanking Undersecretary Crane.
Thank you.
And if I could just make one final comment, there is a happy hour that is sponsored by Galvanize down the street at the Henry Hotel, which is at 13th and F. Everybody here is welcome to join us there, and that'll be a fun way to continue the conversation. And thanks, everybody, and we'll go out to the green room here.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thanks. We can go out.